The wind is a blade, and Alara Vance thinks it might finally be the thing that cuts the last thread of her life. Each gust is a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and the memory of warmth from her bones. Snow isn't falling anymore. It's a solid, churning wall of white that has erased the world. There is no sky, no ground, only the screaming void and the burn of ice against her face. Her hunger is a hollow ache that has long since passed the point of pain, settling into a dull, leaden weakness in her limbs. She is a ghost haunting her own body, and she knows, with the detached clarity of a medical professional observing a failing patient, that she is in the final stages of exposure. Then, through the deafening shriek of the blizzard, she sees it. A stain of darkness against the suffocating white. It's a shape, low to the ground, a mound that is wrong. Hope is a dangerous, exhausting luxury, but some instinct deeper than thought forces her legs to stumble forward. One step, then another. The dark shape resolves into the carcass of a horse, its form already softened by a shroud of new snow. And beside it, half buried, is the unmistakable shape of a man. He is a heap of buckskin and desperation, a fur hat pulled low, one leg bent at an angle that speaks of shattered bone. He is terrifyingly still. She falls to her knees beside him, her own exhaustion forgotten in a sudden, sharp surge of purpose. Her fingers, clumsy and numb inside thin gloves, find the pulse at his neck. It's there, a thready, stubborn flutter against the frozen landscape of his skin. A life as precarious as her own. She has nothing left. No food, no shelter, no direction. Saving him is madness. Leaving him is impossible. That was a close call. Before we see how our heroine navigates this, tell us in the comments. What's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. He is a dead weight, heavy with wet snow and the inertia of unconsciousness. The part of her brain that is a nurse, the part that has lifted and turned men twice her size in hushed city hospital wards, assesses the situation with brutal pragmatism. Compound fracture, tibia, severe exposure, possible concussion. The part of her that is just a woman, lost and starving, screams that she cannot possibly move him. But a flicker of movement near his buried hand catches her eye. A small, engraved compass, its chain wrapped around his wrist. It's pointing north. And to the north, barely visible as a faint disruption in the blizzard's fury, is a line of pines. Trees meant shelter. Trees might mean a cabin. It was a gamble against impossible odds, but it was the only one on the table. With a groan that was part prayer and part curse, she hooked her arms under his, braced her failing body, and began to drag him toward the ghost of a treeling. She was a famished nurse, a fugitive from a life that had discarded her, and now she was a beast of burden, hauling a half-dead stranger through the heart of a blizzard, guided by nothing more than the desperate hope that his compass was not lying. The world returned to Silas Blackwood in fragments of pain and sound. The first was the relentless roar, a deep-throated growl that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. The wind. He knew it like he knew the grain of the axe handle in his palm. This was no mere storm. This was a cleansing, the kind of blizzard that scoured the mountains clean and remade the landscape. The second was the fire in his left leg, a searing, grinding agony that eclipsed all else. He remembered the sickening crack of bone, the world tilting as his mare, Daisy, lost her footing on an unseen patch of ice. He remembered the crushing weight, and then nothing. Now there was a different sensation, a warmth that had no place in the frozen hell he'd last inhabited. It was a gentle, radiating heat on his right side, the scent of pine smoke thick in the air. He was inside. He forced his eyelids open, the lashes gritty with sleep or something worse. The light was dim, flickering. He was in his own cabin, on his own cot. The realization was so jarring, so impossible, that for a moment he thought he must have died, and this was some peculiar, homespun corner of the afterlife. A shadow moved in the periphery. He tried to turn his head, but the effort sent a fresh wave of fire up his leg, and a low groan escaped his lips. The shadow solidified into a person, leaning over him. It was a woman. Her face was pale and gaunt, etched with lines of fatigue that made her seem older than the youth in her eyes suggested. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back in a severe, practical knot, but loose strands clung to her temples. She placed a hand on his forehead, her touch surprisingly cool and professional. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was low and raspy, as if from disuse or a sore throat. "Don't try to move. Your leg is broken." Silas stared at her. A woman. In his cabin. In the middle of a blizzard that had likely been raging for days. He tried to piece it together. His mind was a muddy river, thoughts snagging on debris. He remembered the fall, the cold seeping in, the certainty of his own end. How had he gotten here? How had she? Who? He managed, his own voice a dry crackle. "My name is Alara Vance," she said, her expression unreadable. She moved with a quiet efficiency, checking the crude splint on his leg. It was his own axe handle and strips of his saddle leather, bound with a precision he found startling. "You were trapped. I found you." He looked past her, at the single room that comprised his entire world. It was a small, sturdy box built of lodgepole pine, chinked with mud and moss against the drafts. His rifle was on its pegs above the stone fireplace. His few books were stacked on a crate. Everything was as he had left it, yet profoundly altered by her presence. A stranger had breached his fortress of solitude. A half-starved-looking woman who spoke with the clipped authority of someone used to giving orders. "The storm," he rasped. "It's still going," she confirmed, her gaze flicking to the single window, now a solid pane of white. "I believe it's been 2 days since I brought you in." 2 days. He had lost 2 days. He had been at her mercy for 2 days. The thought sent a jolt of unease through him, a feeling so foreign in his self-reliant life that it was almost as sharp as the pain in his leg. He was a man who depended on no one. He'd built this life with his own 2 hands, carving a space for himself far from the clutter and noise of other people. Now, he was crippled, helpless, and indebted to a ghost who had appeared out of the snow. He saw her medical bag then, a worn leather satchel sitting open on the floor. It was filled with rolled bandages, small glass vials, and the glint of steel instruments. A nurse. That explained the hands, the voice, the splint. But it explained nothing else. What was a nurse doing wandering the high country in the dead of winter, dressed in clothes ill-suited for the weather, looking as if she hadn't eaten a square meal in a month? "You brought me here?" he asked, the logistics of it boggling his mind. He was not a small man. A flicker of something, pride, or maybe just the memory of effort, crossed her face. "I did." It wasn't easy. The understatement hung in the air between them. He owed her his life. The knowledge settled in his chest, a heavy, unfamiliar weight. He looked at her again, truly looked. The hollows under her cheekbones, the faint tremor in her hands as she refolded the piece of cloth. She was as much a survivor of this storm as he was, and by the looks of her, her journey had been longer and harder than his. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate, pebbles tossed into a canyon. She gave a small, stiff nod, as if thanks were a transaction she understood but had no time for. "You need to rest. I gave you what I could for the pain, but it's mostly willow bark tea. We need to conserve supplies." Her focus was on survival. He understood that. It was the only language the mountains spoke. He let his head fall back against the rolled-up blanket that served as his pillow, his world shrinking to the confines of the cot, the fire, and the mysterious woman who had pulled him back from the brink. The wind howled outside, a mournful beast clawing at the walls, but for the first time, Silas Blackwood was not entirely alone in his fight against it. He didn't know if that was a comfort or a complication. The days that followed blurred into a routine dictated by necessity and pain. The blizzard did not abate. It was a living entity, a siege engine laying waste to the world outside their small fortress. The wind's voice shifted from a howl to a deep, resonant moan and back again, a constant reminder of their isolation. Snow drifted up past the bottom of the window, sealing them in a dim, perpetual twilight. Alara moved about the cabin with a tireless, almost grim, determination. She was the keeper of the fire, the rationer of their dwindling food, and the guardian of his health. Silas, trapped in the horizontal world of his cot, could do nothing but watch. He watched her measure out the handful of beans for their single daily meal, her movements precise and economical. He watched her melt snow for water, her face illuminated by the flames of the hearth, making the sharp angles of her hunger seem softer. He watched her check his splint, her touch impersonal yet gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration. She rarely spoke unless it was necessary. "How is the pain?" "Drink this. The wood is running low." Her voice remained a quiet counterpoint to the storm's fury. Silas, a man accustomed to the solitude of his own thoughts, found himself unnerved by her silence. It was not a comfortable quiet, it was a guarded one. He was a curiosity to her, a patient, a problem to be solved. He, in turn, was consumed by the puzzle of her. "Where were you headed?" he asked one afternoon, the words tearing through the thick silence. He'd been watching her mend a tear in her own worn coat, her stitches small and neat. She didn't look up from her work. "East. East is a broad direction," he countered, his voice rough from disuse. "It was broad enough for me." Her needle paused for a fraction of a second before continuing its steady rhythm. The conversation, it seemed, was over. He tried again a day later, when she was cleaning his wound. The laudanum she'd found in his small medicine chest was long gone, and the pain was a constant, throbbing companion. He focused on her face to distract himself, on the stray wisp of hair that had escaped her bun and curled against her cheek. "You're a long way from any place a nurse might be needed," he observed, trying to keep his tone casual. This time, she met his gaze. Her eyes were a clear, startling gray, like a winter sky just before the snow. "It seems I was needed here." It was a deflection, but it was also the undeniable truth. He was alive because of her. The debt weighed on him. In his world, debts were paid. A man's word, his honor, was all he had. But what was the payment for a life? He began to learn her not through words, but through actions. He saw the way she held herself, with a straight-backed posture that spoke of discipline and pride, even when she swayed with dizziness from lack of food. He saw the way she cared for her medical instruments, cleaning and drying them by the firelight as if they were precious jewels. He noticed she never looked at her reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror he kept by the wash basin. She seemed determined to take up as little space as possible, to be a functional presence, not a personal one. One evening, the fever took him. The world dissolved into a sweltering, nightmarish soup. The pain in his leg became a monstrous, devouring thing. He was back on the mountain, the snow filling his mouth, the weight of his dead horse pressing the life from him. He thrashed and shouted, lost in the delirium. Through the red haze, he felt a cool cloth on his forehead, a steady hand holding a cup to his lips. He heard a voice, no longer clipped and professional, but soft, murmuring words he couldn't understand, a gentle litany that cut through the fever's static. He surfaced from the darkness hours later, drenched in sweat but clear-headed. The fever had broken. Alara was slumped in the cabin's single wooden chair, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand still loosely holding his. She was asleep, her face unguarded for the first time. The mask of detached competence had fallen away, revealing a profound and aching weariness. He could see the faint, bluish tinge of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the vulnerability in the line of her jaw. He lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake her. In the flickering firelight, she looked impossibly young. A girl playing at being a woman, carrying burdens that were far too heavy for her. He felt a powerful, unfamiliar surge of protectiveness. It was more than gratitude. It was a primal instinct to shield this fragile, stubborn creature from whatever had driven her into the heart of the storm. He carefully, slowly, shifted his fingers until they were laced with hers. Her hand was small and cool in his. She stirred slightly in her sleep, her fingers tightening around his for a moment before relaxing. In that small, unconscious gesture, a silent pact was made. They were no longer just a patient and a nurse. They were two souls tethered together in the vast, roaring emptiness of the winter. The breaking of the fever marked a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Though the blizzard continued its relentless assault, something inside their small shelter had eased. Silas's mind was clear, and while his body was still a prison of pain and weakness, he was no longer just a passive observer. He was a partner, albeit a stationary one. "The woodpile by the door," he said one morning, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "How much is left?" Alara, who was stirring their now watery bean broth, glanced toward the small stack of logs. "Enough for 2 days, maybe 3 if I'm careful with the fire. There's a loose floorboard beneath my cot," he instructed. "To the left of the head. Pry it up. There's a space underneath. I keep seasoned kindling there, and a small emergency stash of firewood. She looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her gray eyes. She retrieved the iron poker from the hearth and, following his directions, knelt by the cot. She worked the board loose, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. It was exactly as he'd said. Neat stacks of dry, split pine, and a bundle of fat wood for starting fires. "This will help," she said, her voice holding a note of genuine relief. "This will help a great deal." It was the first piece of himself, of his foresight and knowledge, that he had been able to offer. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. He was contributing again, not just receiving. The balance was beginning to shift. He taught her the cabin's secrets from his cot. He told her where to find the extra sack of flour hidden in the rafters, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the mice out. He described the location of a small box of salted pork he'd buried in a snowdrift on the north side of the cabin, a natural icebox, before the worst of the storm had hit. Finding it was a risk, but one they needed to take. Alara listened intently, her face serious. She bundled herself in his spare wool coat, which swallowed her small frame, wrapped a scarf around her face, and tied a rope from the door handle to her waist. His idea. "If the wind blinds you, you can follow the rope back," he'd insisted, the image of her disappearing into the white torrent a cold knot of fear in his gut. He lay there, helpless, listening to the storm rage, the minutes stretching into an eternity. He timed her by the beat of his own anxious heart. The sound of the door opening again, letting in a swirl of snow and frigid air, was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. She stumbled in, gasping, her eyebrows and the scarf around her mouth caked in ice. But in her arms, she clutched the small, precious crate of salt pork. She collapsed by the fire, shivering, but her eyes held a triumphant gleam. "You were right," she panted, unwrapping her scarf. "It was right where you said." That night, they ate slices of fried salt pork with their beans. The richness of the fat, the sharp tang of the salt, was a feast. It was the most delicious meal Silas had ever tasted. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled between them, different from the tense quiet of the first few days. It was the silence of shared victory. "You're a good student," he said, breaking the quiet. She looked up, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time. It transformed her face, softening the harsh lines of fatigue and worry. "You're a good teacher." He started to see more of the woman beneath the nurse's formidable facade. He learned she had a quiet, dry wit that would surface at unexpected moments. One afternoon, as he laboriously explained how to clean and oil his rifle to prevent it from rusting in the damp air, she listened with solemn patience. When he was finished, she took the rifle and began to disassemble it with a practiced familiarity that stunned him. "Where did a nurse learn to do that?" he asked, genuinely bewildered. "My father was a doctor in the army," she said, not missing a beat as she wiped down the barrel. "He believed a woman should know how to patch a wound, fire a gun, and read a map. He said it made for fewer complications in life." "He sounds like a wise man," Silas said, watching her hands move with deft confidence. "He was," she replied, and a shadow passed over her face, a fleeting glimpse of a past she kept so carefully locked away. The moment was gone as quickly as it came, and she was once again focused on the task at hand. As his strength slowly returned, their roles began to reverse. He could now sit up for long periods, his back propped against the wall. He took over the tasks he could manage from his cot, mending a broken harness, sharpening his knives, braiding a new rope from scraps of leather. He would watch her as she worked, and a slow, creeping warmth would spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He admired her resilience, her refusal to complain or despair. She met every challenge, the dwindling food, the relentless cold, his own grim moods, with the same steady, unflinching competence. One night, a new sound joined the wind's chorus. A low, guttural howling, closer than the wind. Wolves, drawn by the scent of his dead mare, their hunger sharpened by the long storm. The sound sent a primal chill down Silas's spine. For Alara, who had only ever known the dangers of the city, it was a sound of pure terror. He saw her go rigid, her eyes wide and fixed on the door. "They can't get in," he said, his voice a low rumble of reassurance. "The walls are solid. The door is barred. There are so many of them," she whispered, her voice trembling. The howling grew louder, a hungry symphony from all sides of the cabin. They were circling, testing for weakness. Silas felt a surge of adrenaline, his helplessness a fresh and bitter pill. If he were on his feet, he would have been outside with his rifle, firing a warning shot, asserting his dominance over his territory. But he was trapped, and she was terrified. He reached out his hand. Alara. She looked at him, her fear naked on her face. Come here, he said softly. She hesitated for a moment, then crossed the small room and sat on the floor by his cot, drawing her knees up to her chest. She was close enough that he could feel the tremors running through her. They're just animals, driven by hunger, he explained, his voice calm and steady. They're looking for an easy meal. This cabin is not an easy meal. They'll move on. He talked to her through the long night, his voice a low anchor in the storm of her fear. He told her stories of the mountains, of tracking elk in the high meadows, of the way the aspens turned to gold in the autumn. He spoke of his life, not the deep, wounded parts, but the simple, quiet rhythms of it. He described the satisfaction of building this cabin, of felling each tree and setting each stone in the fireplace with his own hands. He spoke of a solitude that was chosen, not forced upon him. He was talking as much to distract her as to reassure himself. Her fear had become his own, not of the wolves, but for her. He could not bear the thought of her being afraid. As he spoke, she slowly uncurled, her trembling subsiding. She rested her head against the side of his cot, her eyes closing. The howling outside continued, but it had lost some of its menace. It was just a part of the wild world, and they were safe in their small, warm haven. He fell silent, watching the rise and fall of her shoulders with each breath. She was asleep. He hadn't realized until that moment how desperately he had come to rely on her presence. The thought of being in this cabin alone again, even on his own 2 feet, felt unbearable. The silence was no longer something he craved. It was a void she had filled. He looked at the rifle on the wall, then at the sleeping woman by his side. He had built this place to keep the world out. Now, all he wanted was to keep her in. The siege of the wolves lasted 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, the howling was gone, replaced by the familiar, monotonous voice of the wind. A fragile peace returned to the cabin. The shared danger had forged a new level of intimacy between them. The unspoken boundaries had softened. Silas found himself watching her constantly, cataloging the small details that made her Alara. The way she bit her lip when she was concentrating. The faint dusting of freckles across her nose, invisible until she stood in the direct path of a sunbeam that had managed to pierce the cloudy sky for a brief moment. The way she would sometimes hum a tuneless melody under her breath, a sad, half-forgotten little song. He was healing. The sharp, grinding pain in his leg had subsided into a deep, throbbing ache. With Alara's help, he began to move, first just shifting on the cot, then, using a makeshift crutch he fashioned from a sturdy tree branch she'd brought in, he managed to stand. The first time he put weight on his good leg, the room tilted violently, and he would have fallen if not for her. She was there instantly, her small frame braced against his, her arm a strong, steadying band around his waist. Easy, she murmured, her cheek pressed against his chest. Slowly, he leaned on her, his head swimming. He was acutely aware of her closeness, the scent of wood smoke and something uniquely her own, a faint, clean scent like rain on dry earth. Her hair was soft against his rough wool shirt. For a long moment, they just stood there, a tableau of mutual support. He, the large, broken man, and she, the small, unyielding woman holding him up. The patient and the nurse. The rescued and the rescuer. All the lines were blurred now. I'm all right, he said finally, his voice thick. She helped him to the chair by the fire, and he sank into it, exhausted but triumphant. It was a victory. He was vertical. He was no longer confined to the cot that had been his world for what felt like a lifetime. From his new vantage point, he saw the cabin through different eyes. He saw the toll their survival had taken. The woodpile was nearly gone. The last of the flour was a dusty film at the bottom of the sack. He saw the weariness in Alara's posture, a slight slump in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. They had survived the blizzard, but the siege of winter was far from over. With his mobility partially restored, he could contribute more. He showed her how to set snares for rabbits near the edge of the tree line, describing the subtle signs of a game trail. She was a quick learner, and the first time she returned with a small snowshoe hare in her trap, her face was alight with a fierce, primal pride. He felt a ridiculous surge of his own pride, as if her success were his. He taught her how to skin and dress the animal, a grim but necessary task. She did not flinch, her medical training serving her well. The rabbit stew they made that night was thin, but it was fresh meat, and it tasted like hope. Their conversations grew longer, meandering into the quiet corners of the evenings. He learned she was from Philadelphia, that her father had been her whole world, and that his death a year prior had unmoored her. She spoke of the hospital where she'd worked, her passion for the science of healing evident in her words. But when she spoke of why she left, her voice would become guarded again, the open plains of her stories turning into a landscape of high-walled canyons. There was a disagreement, she would say, her hands busy with some small task, her eyes averted. A matter of professional opinion. I found it best to seek a new position. Silas knew there was more to it. He could hear the unspoken words hanging in the air, could see the flicker of old pain in her eyes. A disagreement didn't send a woman fleeing into the wilderness in the dead of winter. But he didn't push. He had his own locked rooms, his own ghosts he wasn't ready to introduce. He knew that trust, like a cabin, had to be built one log at a time. One afternoon, seeking more firewood, Alara ventured farther than usual. She came back not with wood, but with his saddlebags, which she dug out from the snow near where Daisy had fallen. They were frozen solid, but she set them by the fire to thaw. Inside, amongst his personal effects, was a small, leather-bound book. It was a copy of Emerson's essays, the cover worn smooth with use, the pages softened at the edges. Alara picked it up, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. "I didn't take you for a reader of philosophy," she said, a gentle tease in her voice. "A man needs something to occupy his thoughts up here," he said, a little defensively. "The winters are long. Would you read some of it to me?" she asked, her voice suddenly small. "My father used to read to me in the evenings." He hesitated. His voice was a tool for giving orders to a dog or cursing a stubborn mule, not for reading poetry aloud. But the hopeful, almost wistful look on her face was impossible to deny. He took the book from her, found a familiar page, and began to read. "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string." His voice was rough at first, but he soon found a rhythm. The words of the essay, once a private comfort, took on new meaning as he spoke them into the shared space of the cabin. He read about self-reliance, about nature, about the oversoul that connected all things. He glanced up and saw Alara staring into the fire, her face rapt and still. The words were a bridge between them, connecting his solitary world of thought with her own. When he finished the chapter and his voice trailed off, the silence that followed was full and deep. "Thank you," she whispered, not looking at him. I haven't heard reading like that in a long time." In that moment, leaning on his crutch by the fire, reading dusty words to a woman he barely knew, Silas felt a sense of rightness, of profound contentment, that he hadn't experienced in years. The blizzard could rage on. The wolves could howl. Here, in this small bubble of warmth and flickering light, something new was being built. It was fragile and unnamed, but it felt more real and solid than the stone of his hearth. It felt like the beginning of a life he had never thought to have. Then, one morning, they awoke to a different world. The wind had died. The silence was so absolute, so profound, that it was more shocking than the storm's roar had been. Silas pushed himself up and hobbled to the window. He scraped away the frost with his thumbnail. Sunlight. It was a pale, watery, winter sunlight, but it was there. It streamed through the small clearing in the glass, illuminating a world transformed. The snow lay in massive, sculpted drifts, sparkling with a million tiny diamonds. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue. The blizzard was over. The sight should have filled him with relief. Instead, a cold dread washed over him. The end of the storm meant the end of their isolation. It meant the outside world, with its rules and its roads and its dangers, could now intrude. It meant that Alara had no more reason to stay. She came to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. She too was staring out at the new, silent landscape. He could feel the shift in her, a new tension in her posture. Their shared ordeal was over. Now what? It's over, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was impossible to tell if she was relieved or saddened. Looks that way, he replied, his own voice grim. The practicalities of the new reality asserted themselves immediately. They were still desperately low on supplies. His leg, while healing, was far from mended. He couldn't ride, couldn't make the long journey to the nearest town, Redemption, for at least a few more weeks. But she could. The unspoken question hung between them, as bright and sharp as the sunlight on the snow. What would she do now? Her purpose here was fulfilled. She had saved him. She was free to go. The thought of her walking away from the cabin, disappearing back into the world that had hurt her, left a hollow space in his chest. I need to get to town, he said, forcing the words out. For supplies. And to see a doctor about this leg. Make sure it's setting right. You can't travel on it yet, she stated, her nurse's authority returning. It would be foolish. Then you should go, he said, the words tasting like ash. You can take the trail down to Redemption. Tell them what happened. They can send someone back up with a sled for me. He was offering her an out. It was the right thing to do, the honorable thing. He owed her that. He owed her her freedom. She turned from the window to face him. Her expression was complicated, a mix of emotions he couldn't begin to decipher. And what of you? I'll be fine. I've been on my own a long time. The words sounded hollow, a lie he was telling himself as much as her. And what of me? She asked again, her voice quiet but intense. Where do you propose I go from Redemption? Just continue east. The question caught him off guard. He had assumed she had a plan, a destination. But looking at her now, at the uncertainty in her eyes, he realized she was as adrift as he was. Her flight into the wilderness hadn't been a journey to somewhere. It had been a flight from somewhere. This was his chance, the moment to say what had been growing in his heart for weeks. But the words wouldn't come. He was a man of actions, not speeches. How could he ask her to stay? What could he offer her? A broken-down rancher in a one-room cabin, a man with a past he never spoke of and a future that was as uncertain as the weather. Asking her to stay felt selfish, like asking her to trade one prison for another. Before he could speak, she made a decision. No, she said, her chin lifting with that familiar, stubborn resolve. My work isn't done. You're still my patient. I'll stay until you're on your feet, properly on your feet. Then we will both go to Redemption. Together. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his good knee. She was staying. It was a reprieve, a temporary stay of execution, but it was enough. All right, he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Together. The decision changed everything. Their time was no longer indefinite, stretching out in a haze of blizzard-bound days. It now had an endpoint, the journey to Redemption. This new reality brought with it a sense of urgency, a feeling that the quiet, sheltered world they had built was living on borrowed time. In the weeks that followed, as Silas's leg grew stronger and the snow began to recede under the strengthening sun, a new, tender awkwardness grew between them. The easy intimacy of survival was replaced by a keen awareness of each other as a man and a woman. The accidental brush of hands as she passed him a plate, the shared glances across the crackling fire, the way he would watch her as she stood in the doorway, looking out at the mountains, all of it was charged with an unspoken current. He taught her to shoot the rifle, his hands guiding hers, his body close behind her to show her the proper stance. He could feel her warmth through her coat, smell the clean scent of her hair. He found himself lingering, his instructions growing more detailed than necessary, just to prolong the moment. She, in turn, seemed to lean into his presence, her initial stiffness giving way to a soft yielding. One evening, as she was changing the dressing on his leg for what would be one of the last times, her fingers brushed against the healed skin. It was a light, almost accidental touch, but it sent a jolt through him. He reached out and caught her hand, stopping her movement. Her skin was soft, her fingers slender but strong. "Alara," he said, his voice low. She looked up, her gray eyes wide and luminous in the firelight. The air grew thick, heavy with all the things they hadn't said. He saw fear in her eyes, but also a dawning hope, a question. He knew, in that moment, that he was lost. This woman, this stranger who had stumbled out of a blizzard, had laid claim to his heart as surely as he had laid claim to this land. He lifted her hand to his lips, and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was a courtly, old-fashioned gesture, something he might have read in a book, but it felt like the only way to express the reverence he felt for her. She didn't pull away. A slow blush crept up her neck, coloring her pale cheeks. She stared at their joined hands, then back at his face. "Silas," she whispered, his name a soft exhalation. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to tell her that the thought of her leaving was like imagining the sun falling from the sky. He wanted to ask her to stay, to build a life with him, to fill the silence of his cabin with her quiet humming and her fierce, gentle presence. But the shadow of her past, the reason she had fled, still lay between them. He couldn't ask for her future without understanding what she had run from. "When we get to redemption," he began, his voice raspy with emotion, "you'll be safe with me. Whatever it is, whatever you're afraid of, you won't have to face it alone." Tears welled in her eyes, shimmering but not falling. She nodded, a single, jerky movement. It was not a confession, but it was an acceptance of his protection, an acceptance of their bond. She squeezed his hand, then gently pulled hers away and went back to her work, her movements once again brisk and professional. But the air had cleared. A promise had been made. They would go to redemption together, and they would face what came next, together. The world was waiting for them, but for the first time, Silas didn't feel the need to hide from it. He was ready to fight for the new world he had found right here, in the heart of his once lonely cabin. The day finally came when his leg was strong enough for the journey. The trail down the mountain was treacherous, slick with melting snow and slicker mud, but the world felt new and clean. The air was sharp and pine-scented. For Silas, who had been confined for so long, every sensation was magnified. For Alara, it was the first time she had seen the landscape that had almost claimed her in anything but a maelstrom of white. She looked at the towering peaks and the vast, forested valleys with a kind of awe. They traveled slowly, Silas leaning heavily on his crutch, their single remaining packhorse carrying their meager supplies. They spoke little, the quiet companionship of the trail replacing the charged silence of the cabin. They were a team, moving with a shared rhythm, each aware of the other's needs. As they descended, the town of Redemption came into view, nestled in a fold of the valley below. It was a small, rugged collection of unpainted wooden buildings, a plume of smoke rising from a blacksmith's forge. To Silas, it was a necessary evil, a place to get supplies and news before retreating back to his solitude. But today, approaching it with Alara by his side, it felt different. It felt like a test. They entered the town's single dusty street and immediately drew stares. A rough-looking man like Silas was common enough, but the woman with him, pale and fine-boned despite her worn clothes, was an anomaly. And the fact that they were emerging from the mountains together, after the worst blizzard in a decade, was fuel for instant gossip. Whispers followed them like burrs on a saddle blanket. Their first stop was the doctor's office. Doc Miller was a grizzled, weary man who'd seen everything. He examined Silas's leg with practiced hands. "Well, Blackwood," he grunted, probing the healed bone. "Whoever set this knew what they were doing. It's as clean a set as I could have managed myself." "You were lucky." Silas looked at Alara, who stood quietly by the window, her back to them. "I was," he said, the word filled with more meaning than the doctor could possibly know. Their next stop was the general store. The proprietor, a portly man named Henderson with small, shrewd eyes, greeted Silas with forced joviality that quickly turned to undisguised curiosity as he took in Alara. "Silas, good to see you made it through the big blow. We'd about written you off," he boomed. "And who's this you've brought down from the mountain?" "This is Miss Vance," Silas said, his voice low and flat, a clear warning not to pry. "We need supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, bacon, and a bolt of wool. Dark blue if you have it." The last was for Alara, a silent promise of a new, warm dress. As Henderson measured out the goods, the door to the store swung open and two men entered. One was the town sheriff, a decent but plodding man named Ames. The other was a stranger. He was dressed in a crisp city suit and a derby hat that looked absurdly out of place. He had a narrow, intelligent face and cold, assessing eyes that swept the room and landed, with unnerving precision, on Alara. Alara went rigid. All the color drained from her face, leaving it a stark, white mask of terror. She took an involuntary step back, bumping into a stack of crates. The man in the derby hat smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. Well, the trail wasn't as cold as I feared. Alara Vance, I presume. Sheriff Ames looked from the stranger to Alara, his expression one of confusion. What's this about, Mr. Davies? This, the man named Davies said, his voice crisp and self-assured, is about justice. I'm a private agent, hired by the esteemed Croft family of Philadelphia. This woman, who calls herself a nurse, is wanted for questioning in the death of their patriarch, Mr. Alastair Croft. The charge, he added, his eyes locking on Alara with cruel satisfaction, is murder. The word fell into the sudden, shocked silence of the store like a stone into a deep well. Henderson froze, his hand hovering over a sack of beans. Sheriff Ames's hand went instinctively to the pistol on his hip. Everyone's eyes were on Alara. She looked small and fragile, cornered and terrified. This was it. The past she had fled so desperately had finally caught up to her. Silas moved. He didn't think, he just acted. He took one step, planting himself firmly between Alara and the man from the city. He was no longer the broken man from the cabin. He was tall and solid, his presence filling the space, a mountain of quiet menace. He still had his crutch, but he stood on his own 2 feet. You're mistaken, Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Davies raised an eyebrow, amused. Am I? I have a warrant here, issued by a Philadelphia magistrate. And I have a witness who saw Miss Vance administer a fatal dose of morphine. It's all quite clear. What's clear, Silas countered, his eyes never leaving the agent's, is that you're a hired dog from 1,000 miles away, barking up the wrong tree. This woman, Miss Vance, spent the last 2 months saving my life. He turned his head slightly to address Sheriff Ames and the rest of the silent, gaping onlookers. His voice rose, filled with a raw power that commanded their attention. The blizzard that nearly buried this town? I was caught in it. My horse was killed, my leg was shattered. I was left for dead. I was freezing to death in the snow when she found me. He pointed a thumb back toward Alara, who was staring at his back, her eyes wide. This woman, who had nothing, who was half-starved herself, dragged me back to my cabin and kept me alive. She set my bone. She fought off my fever. She fed me from her own rations when there was barely enough for one. She guarded me when wolves were circling our door. Is that the action of a murderer? He let the question hang in the air, the weight of it settling on every person in the room. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the shifting of their allegiance from the official-looking stranger to one of their own. The Croft family is rich, Silas continued, his gaze returning to Davies. They can buy warrants and hire men like you to hound an innocent woman across the country. But their money has no currency here. In these mountains, a person's worth is measured by their grit and their character. And I am telling you, as a man whose life she holds in her hands, that Alara Vance's character is beyond reproach. He took a deep breath, preparing to lay his final card on the table. This was it, the leap into a future he hadn't known he wanted until it was threatened. She is not some fugitive for you to drag back in chains. She is the woman I intend to marry. She is going to be my wife. Her home is with me, at my ranch. If you have a problem with that, your argument is not with her. It is with me. And by extension, he added, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the townsfolk, it is with this entire community. A murmur went through the store. He had made it personal. He had made it about them, about their own code of frontier justice and loyalty. Sheriff Ames, a man who understood the local currents far better than any city agent, cleared his throat. He looked at Davies's warrant, then at Silas's resolute face, and finally at the terrified but determined woman standing behind him. Mr. Davies, the sheriff said slowly, this warrant is from another territory. It holds little legal sway here without being certified by our own judge, and Judge Miller is out on the circuit for another week. Until then, Miss Vance is under the protection of Mr. Blackwood, and as a resident of this county, she's under my protection as well. I suggest you find a room at the hotel and wait for the judge. It was a dismissal. Davies knew it. His face tightened with fury, but he saw the closed ranks, the hard, unyielding faces of the mountain folk. He was an outsider, and his authority had vanished. This isn't over, Blackwood, he snarled, his eyes full of venom. "It is for today," Silas said calmly. He turned, ignoring the agent, and his eyes found Alara's. Her face was a storm of emotions: shock, gratitude, terror, and something else, something deep and shining. Tears were streaming freely down her cheeks now, but they were not tears of fear. He reached out, and, in front of the entire town, gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. He had called her his wife. He had made her his entire frontier life in one public, irrevocable declaration. He had offered her his name, his home, his protection. He had built a fortress around her, not of logs and stone, but of his own conviction. And in her eyes, he saw his answer. He saw his future. The ride back up the mountain was silent, but it was a silence born of overwhelmed hearts. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vibrant. Silas led the pack horse, his steps sure and steady, the crutch now a relic of a past life. Alara walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The hostile eyes of the town, the threat of the man named Davies, all of it faded with every step they took up the winding trail, back toward the sanctuary of the cabin. When the small, sturdy structure came into view, nestled amongst the pines, it looked different. It was no longer his lonely outpost. The warm light of the setting sun struck the single window, making it gleam like a welcoming beacon. It looked like a home. They unpacked the supplies without a word, moving around each other with a new, tender awareness. He stacked the flour and bacon, while she unwrapped the bolt of dark blue wool, her fingers stroking the soft fabric as if it were the most precious thing she had ever touched. When the chores were done, they stood in the middle of the room, the space between them humming with unspoken emotion. The grand, public declaration in the store now had to be reconciled with the quiet reality of their life. "Silas," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "What you did to what you said." He turned to face her fully. "I meant every word, Alara. You don't even know what happened," she said, her voice choked with tears she was trying to hold back. "You don't know if I'm guilty." "I know you," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. He stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. He gently took her face in his hands, his rough palms cupping her soft cheeks. "I know the woman who sat with me through a fever. I know the woman who was terrified of wolves but stood her ground. I know the woman who learned to shoot a rifle and snare a rabbit to keep us from starving. That's the truth I know. It's more real than any piece of paper a rich man can buy." A sob escaped her, a sound of pain and catharsis. "He was dying," she whispered, the story finally spilling out. "Mr. Croft. He was in so much pain, and his family, they wouldn't allow the doses of morphine he needed. They wanted him lucid to change his will. He begged me. He begged me for relief. I gave him a little more, just enough to let him sleep peacefully. But he was so weak. He never woke up. His son used it as an excuse. He accused me." Silas listened, his heart aching for the impossible choice she'd been forced to make. He wiped away her tears with his thumbs. "You showed a dying man mercy. That's not murder. That's compassion. But you've tied yourself to me now," she cried softly. "You've put yourself in danger for me." "Alara," he said, his gaze intense. "My life was quiet before you came. It was empty. You didn't bring danger into my life. You brought life itself." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of gratitude or comfort. It was a kiss of belonging, a kiss that sealed the promise he had made in the store. It was fierce and tender all at once, a confirmation of everything that had grown between them in the crucible of the blizzard. She melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her hands tangling in his hair, returning his kiss with all the pent-up fear, hope, and love in her heart. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, their shared breath mingling in the cool air of the cabin. The last of the evening light streamed through the window, bathing them in a soft, golden glow. He watched her as she moved to light the lamp, her hands steady now. The small flame flickered to life, pushing back the gathering shadows, filling the room with a warm, intimate light. This small cabin, once his fortress against the world, had become his world. She was his home. She was his future. He had rescued a stranger from a blizzard, and in doing so, he had rescued himself from a life of solitude. He had made her his entire frontier life, and in that act, his own life had finally, truly begun. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.